everything.
Thank you.
It looks like the microphone isn't going to help me, so my soft voice is going to have to shape up in the next 45 minutes. I'm going to speak not for a long time about mainly my experience of being in Gaza during the recent wartime and what that means for Palestine as a whole, and where Gaza is and quickly where the West Bank is today, and then George will give a much more interesting historical talk than me. You may know about me, but if you don't, I'm a documentary filmmaker and campaigner, and Palestine is very close to my heart. It does work, thank you. Palestine is very close to my heart, and I happened to be there during the recent 8-day war. It was a matter of coincidence that I was there and was reporting for every minute of the recent 8-day war. Because I can't see the slides, I'm going to have to rotate myself. As you know, the situation afflicting Gaza comes down to two main things. The first is the violence, which at the moment thankfully is pretty much silent, and the second thing is the violence of the economic treatment, the besiegement which suffocates the economy to a very low pace, let's put it that way, and also the entry and exit. So it's not just a besiegement on the economy, but also civilian traffic as well. This invokes various problems, but for example, youth unemployment is over 70%, adult unemployment is, again, most of the population. 2/3 of the population are registered to receive humanitarian services from the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, the main humanitarian body in Gaza. So as you can see, the baseline is not good even before you start a war or launch rockets on this population of 1.6, 1.7 million Palestinians. Most of them are refugees from, if not 1948, which George I think will go into after me, 1967, the 6-day war, or recent bouts or escalations in violence. They're refugees from these episodes. They're also, most of them, children. Now, Gaza is subject to many stereotypes, and having visited for the first time, I was struck by the fact that the kind of, I hasten to say, quasi-capital Gaza City in the north area of the Gaza Strip is extremely well built up. There is, of course, the odd demolished building because of the warring, but as an exception, Gaza City is developed very much like Cairo, and this invokes the point that there is actually enormous economic inequality in Gaza, but that's just a by-the-way point, that's just a caveat, because when you travel outside of this quasi-capital, this Gaza City in the north area, within minutes you're hitting the refugee camps, which are what make up the rest of the Gaza Strip. This is what they generally look more like than this, that is the refugee camps. As I mentioned, the entry and exit is severely restricted, so although there are thousands of Palestinians going in and out from Gaza every day, most can't. I mean, for example, most of the men in this room would have to pay $250 US to just register to get out, which is actually beyond the means of obviously most people in Gaza. So there are various restrictions to freedom of movement that exist. One of them, just as a detail, is the diplomatic imprisonment, which sees that it's almost impossible for Palestinians to get visas to, for example, give talks in the Western world. A friend of mine, Youssef Al-Jamal, he had his initial visa denied to give a talk about the situation in Gaza in New Zealand just a few days ago. One of my best friends in Gaza has tried for 5 times to get a visa to give talks in the UK, having been sponsored by MEPs, MSPs and MPs. Youssef Al-Jamal speaks, "The people of Palestine, specifically the people of Gaza, have gone through the most painful tragedies in life, yet they never thought of giving up, for they fight for a noble cause. Freedom is our destination, and we are ready to endure whatever is waiting for us ahead. Killing, land confiscation, night raids, airstrikes will make us but more determined to continue the battle for a better tomorrow." The battle is not obviously just an armed battle. He means everything that resistance means, obviously not just armed resistance. That's a friend of mine, Youssef Al-Jamal. As you can see, the Gaza Strip, which is what I'll focus on in this talk, generally speaking, is 42 kilometers in height. As I said, most of it is refugee camps. The orange blob is the Gaza City I was referring to. This map is actually from more than a few years ago when Israel was illegally colonizing the Gaza Strip. These are the colonies here, which, according to the general narrative in Gaza, according to my ability to discern it, was seen as a victory, that Israel was forced to withdraw from its colonization attempts and from its full-time ground occupation in the Gaza Strip. Last summer I took this photograph with this little girl who's a member of the Al-Low family that I'm friends with, and I think that for me it resonates this idea that in a way it's about freedom of movement, it's about freedom of rights to one's land. This is, and it's difficult to see because of the quality of the projector, but this here behind these pylons is an Israeli port city, and these are Israeli communication pylons over here. We're here maybe 1 kilometer away from the border with Israel. And at this point in time last summer, it was too dangerous to proceed any further into the Palestinian territory towards the border for risk of invoking a tank incursion or being shot at by snipers. And this is a young girl that knows that boundary. So if you can just imagine what that's like for, again, most of the population are children, to grow up with that kind of parameter or perimeter set in their mind, and the feeling that there must be of being imprisoned in your own land, and etc. It's the same with the fishermen, not just on the land but also at sea. As you probably know, there's a 3 nautical mile permitted fishing zone inside the Palestinian territorial waters off the Gazan coastline. If you try and go beyond that, you'll be shot at. Obviously, as many people know, you can't also enter the Gaza Strip because of the same naval dominance by the Israeli Navy. But for the fishermen in Gaza, of which there are 3,500, they're doing not a simple job, but a very, very dangerous job, because historically and even recently they have been killed, injured, harassed, arrested, had their property and boats destroyed and stolen by the Israeli Navy. And that's just in the sea. This is a photograph I took just a few days ago inside the beach refugee camp in the north of the Gaza Strip. In fact, this is one of the nicest parts of that refugee camp, which is one of the not nicest refugee camps in Gaza. I mean, generally the refugee camps are not like most people would imagine a refugee camp with tents and etc. But as George will talk about, the refugees are living in what's meant to be a temporary state, but they've been there for decades. So they actually have, as you may well know, structures, homes where they're living, which are solid like this. I think one of the things that's striking for me is that ostensibly the situation in Gaza or in Palestine in general is obviously very, very dire. I mean, empirically it's very dire, and I'll come to that later perhaps. But at the same time there's an amazing resilience of spirit which is really manifest when you visit, and it also manifests itself in an extraordinary welcoming nature and hospitality and openness to internationals visiting for the purpose of solidarity or documentary or whatever. And for me this strikes home one of the symbolic features of the so-called Israel-Palestine conflict. Obviously not really a conflict, it's an occupation. But one of these features is that there is what I perceive to be a humanity disparity on either side of the wall. And perhaps I can elaborate on that later. I probably won't have time. Just to say another caveat to the grim image is that there is a massive focus on education in Gaza, and it's seen as one of the ways that the society can be strengthened under the conditions of, in overview, weakness. So there is an amazing emphasis on education and self-development and etc. in this respect, which is very, very inspiring. This is the Al-Low family home, which was shelled directly by an Israeli tank, which incurred, this is about 2 or 3 kilometers away from the northern border with Israel. Opposite this structure is United Nations run school, which was also struck by Israeli tank shellings in winter 2008-9, the 22-day Gaza war, when, as you probably know, hundreds of Palestinian children were killed. And talking a little bit about the history of the violence in Gaza or in general, when the recent 8-day war started, there was an immediate stockpiling of food, fuel and water and etc. And for almost everyone I know in Gaza, they had lived through, having not left, they had lived through the 22-day Gaza war of winter 2008-9. And so in a way there was a strange kind of it's happening again feeling. which therefore the point here is that in a way there's a kind of normalization of war on Gaza for so many people. And just as an example, my best friend in Gaza, just as a random example, has carried dead bodies of children through the street in numbers. And this is normal. And I think that kind of example sets the background. So someone like this gentleman has seen it all, as you can imagine. Now, following the 22-day Gaza war, obviously attempts are made to restart life as best people can. And that has involved a construction boom in the last 2 years in Gaza as a result of various factors. But there has been an increase in the importing of construction materials. And in this image taken by a friend of mine, there's also the recycling of damaged buildings as well, and etc. So again, that's another positive, micro positive element. This is the beach in West Gaza City, which is actually not busy. You should see it when it's at Ramadan. But as I said, it's like a kind of prison playground. Most of the population of Gaza are children and unable to leave. So this is, again, another map, a tiny area. If you look along the eastern border with Israel, there's this pink slither, which is a no-go military zone, a kind of no man's land, sometimes. In the map they call it a security zone, nice euphemism. In some places there are walls like this slicing up the landscape, and as you can see, the fact that there are 2 layers of walls shows Israel's intentions not to respect the internationally designated border, or as much as that there is one. And in some cases there are fences like this, but the point here is that whatever view you end up with is kind of like insult to injury, because you can actually see the flourishing Israeli settlements from thousands and thousands of residences along the eastern border with Israel. And in many cases there are also militarized outposts like this, complete with remote control machine guns, which is the bedroom window view for, again, hundreds or thousands of Palestinians. And in a way, this image is not an exaggeration, having been there during the recent 8-day war, which saw 59 Palestinian children killed and 1 Israeli infant killed. That kind of image, this 3D graphic produced by a Palestinian friend of mine, not for this purpose but for general consumption, with this kind of 3-dimensional anonymized state terrorizing entity, that in a way, in my experience, was the nature of certainly the recent 8-day war. Because you don't see the soldiers' faces, obviously, especially with the unmanned aerial vehicles, but you don't see the faces, and so it's just, you hear just Israel, or the occupation that is responsible for this or for this. It's not Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, or etc., etc. Again, this photograph, I hope, captures the fact that there's this kind of normalization of violence in Gaza. Now, just a quick couple of notes. I will just ask, how much time have I taken so far?
13, 14.
Okay, great. I'm going to speed up a bit. Along with the normalization button, this is a normalization of the acceptance of militant resistance, armed groups, whatever you want to call them. Obviously, some people call them terrorist groups. As you can imagine, in Gaza, they're not called terrorist groups. But the part that they play is of some significance. Anyway, the point here with this photograph is that this baby girl was injured within days of me arriving in Gaza for the first time, when Israel struck a residential area with several airstrikes. And this kind of collateral damage, to use such cold clinical language, is normal in Gaza. Now, just to give some detail to that, when the recent 8-day war finished at the end of November, with a ceasefire, supposed ceasefire, that has basically generally held back airstrikes from Israel. But preceding the 8-day war, there were regular bouts of escalations, regular bouts of violence between the militant groups and between the Israeli, particularly Air Force, seeing incidents like this one. In this particular incident, Israel, and this is historically in a year before the recent war or so, Israel struck a militant on the motorbike, but also his brother and son. So again, this is not abnormal in the Palestinian experience in Gaza, where Israel is willing to invoke basically unlimited civilian collateral damage in order to execute one militant. Civilian collateral damage, excuse me, to execute one militant. Now, coming up to the chronology of the recent 8-day war, obviously the official narrative, or the almost universally accepted Western narrative, is that Israel was launching a self-defense operation against Hamas, attempting to dent or destroy Hamas's military capacity, infrastructure and personnel. And as you can well imagine, that isn't the right chronology. So this is a tank just over the border, hundreds of meters away from the home of the Abu Dagger family, one of the Abu Dagger families. I'll just explain now what this means. Oh, I was going to, but we don't have a video, so I'm going to have to do it without the video. 6 days before the 14th of November, exactly 6 days, it was the same time of day as when the recent 8-day operation was launched. Israeli force was responsible for the killing of a 13-year-old boy, Hamid Ahmed Yunus Abu Dagger, who was playing football outside of his home with a few of his classmates and neighbourhood friends. We don't know exactly from what military unit the shrapnel came, which sliced up his heart and lungs, which killed him within 5 minutes of being struck. But it was from either a helicopter, a bullet, or from a tank shelling, or etc. Again, it's another curious incident of a Palestinian child casualty as a result of Israeli force, a kind of Israeli force that we can't determine, not least because there are not the adequate resources in Gaza to test shrapnel and chemicals which are found in Gaza, etc. But the point here is that the militant groups in Gaza, I'm trying to use cleaner language than resistance groups or armed groups or terrorist groups, the groups in Gaza responded to the slaying of this 13-year-old innocent who was playing football outside of his home, nowhere near a clash, which is what the BBC reported happened in one article. Reportedly a child was killed between clashes between militants and Israeli incursion soldiers. There were no clashes going on. He was killed just like that at sundown outside of his home. So the militant groups responded to that within a day or two with rocket fire and other means at the State of Israel. And there's an official press release on the Al-Qassam Brigade's website, or I believe it's the Al-Qassam Brigade's, saying we're responding to the killing of this Hamid with this attack. What happened following that was Israel escalated on Gaza, killing various militants and 2 more children, a 15-year-old and a 16-year-old. This is just a few days before the self-defense operation began. What happened at that point after a couple more days was that the militant groups sought a ceasefire, which was denied, and then on Wednesday the 14th of November at sundown, Israel launched Operation Pillar of Cloud, which then they changed to Operation Pillar of Defense, because the true language, Operation Pillar of Cloud, the primary translation from Hebrew, invokes a biblical idea, the protection of the Jewish people by a pillar of cloud, which hasn't gone down well in terms of PR invoking such language by the Israeli state, so they quickly redacted that and neutralized it to Operation Pillar of Defense. This is a police station, as most of the police stations in Gaza were destroyed during the recent 8-day war, minutes walk from my home. I already said that 59 Palestinian children were killed during the operation. Almost 180 Palestinians were killed. Less than 5 Israelis were killed. This is governmental infrastructure, the Prime Minister's office in Gaza destroyed. Now, if we think about this objectively, this is an act of international state terrorism. It's like blowing up George's office over the road, or Parliament, yeah? But in Gaza, no one cares, yeah? And so it goes on and it goes on. Most of the main civilian administrative buildings were destroyed during the war. In the latter days of the operation, when I think there was a sense that things were going to be drawn to a close imminently, Israel upped the pounding of such infrastructure, including bridges, in those latter days. Israel also targeted, and has admitted to doing so, infrastructure and personnel of the media in Gaza. So this is the roof and the top 11th floor of the Al-Sharouk building, journalist building in central Gaza City, when Israel struck communicational infrastructure, satellites on the roof, which this has all come out into the public domain. It injured around a dozen Palestinian media workers, including including one guy who had to have his leg amputated. And this is all very clearly in the public domain. So this is the Al-Dalo family massacre, and there were various massacres that took place during the recent war. The Al-Dalo massacre is just one of them. There's also the Al-Hijazi massacre, the Al-Zur massacre, and it goes on, depending on your threshold for using the word massacre, but it truly does go on and on. Just to give some more detail about this, Israel recently changed its policy, or made more explicit its policy, that it's willing to strike the homes of militants, not just while they're firing rockets, or where they're at weapons storage facilities, or where they're in transit, but the homes of the militants. I don't have to tell you that who lives in homes. It's women, children and elderly people, as well as military-age men. And so that's why we saw pronounced massacres like the Al-Dalo massacre. Just to give you some detail about that from Human Rights, I don't lose my papers. The Human Rights Watch report that looked at the 8-day war counted 18 absolutely clear examples of totally unjustifiable airstrikes on civilians when there was no militants present, no clashes or anything like this, which could never be justified, basically. And this time, with this 8-day war compared to the 22-day war, Human Rights Watch didn't even bother to wait for the Israeli investigation, because they'd learned the hard lesson that Israel's investigations don't mean anything, because they're not really investigations and they don't really meet the standards of international law. So they found 18 airstrikes. Just to give you some examples, on November 19th, not day two of the war, took middle way through the war, an Israeli drone, or more than one Israeli drone strikes, killed 3 men in a truck carrying tomatoes 2/3 of the way down the Gaza Strip. A science teacher sitting in his front yard with his 3-year-old son on his lap, targeted by drone strikes. It goes on and it goes on. It goes on and it goes on. There are over 1,400 injured. Almost all of them were civilians. Over 80% were women or children alone. And so I hope what this image that I'm trying to make sends home is that you can imagine why language like state terrorist, state terrorizing force, and etc. is used so quickly, because, well, that's my experience, that Israel is a state terrorizing rogue state, and it doesn't really care about any law or any moral code. And the current trajectory is increased land confiscation, increased resource confiscation, and killing and injuring and arresting, abducting more and more Palestinians. How much time do I have left, someone please?
5 to 8.
5 minutes?
It's 5 to 8 now, so by the time you
Okay, I don't know what time we started, so...
Keep going now.
Okay, thank you. There's unfortunately too much to talk about with the recent war. There's a video which looks like it's going to play. It's not going to play. This is one of the Al-Hijazi babies that was killed during the recent war. Israel struck the Al-Hijazi family home, killing this 2-year-old Mohammed and his 4-year-old brother and their father. Now, the mother who woke up in hospital to that news had named this baby, Mohammed, after his elder brother who was killed during the 22-day previous war. So she woke up with this devastating news. And this is just one example of too many to go into. But this is the Al-Hijazi family massacre, which, unlike the Al-Dalo family massacre, the one I was referring to moments ago, hasn't basically got any international media attention at all. As I mentioned before, most of the population are children, and as you can imagine, children are obviously least physiologically and psychologically prepared to deal with, well, war, particularly Israel's kinds of wars, or generally the occupation and the besiegement of Gaza, generally speaking. What this means is, according to reports from entities like UNICEF, that most of the children, indeed most of the population, but more of the children, suffer from some kind of obvious diagnosable form of mental health problem. Bedwetting is a major problem, as is social anxiety, as is misperformance in school. I can't think of the proper word, but proximity anxiety, where you're afraid to leave your parents, and etc., for 2 discernible reasons. The first is that the children are afraid of leaving the room where their parents are in because they fear that they'll never see them again, and secondly because they're afraid and want support from their parents. And so PTSD and continuing traumatic stress disorder is something which is seen in Gaza, unfortunately, so widespread. And even my friends and even myself suffered from that, having been there during just the recent 8-day war. This is a video I was going to show you, but this is a video taken by a friend of mine, Mahdi, and this is his niece, Suzu. And in the video you would hear an airstrike take place. One airstrike not so close to the roof of the building that they're on, and you can see Suzu's reaction and hear her crying and her wanting relief and etc. And it's a very disturbing video. But the point is that, I mean, it's captured in this still frame, the horror and fear on her face and etc. and etc. She articulates in the video, "I'm afraid of the Israelis, I'm afraid of the Israelis, I'm afraid, I'm afraid." The fact that this is one child out of hundreds of thousands, and it's one airstrike. And during the war, when I was reporting live, we averaged out that there was an airstrike at least every minute, and that every 5 minutes a Palestinian was killed. My friends who went through both operations, that's Operation Pillar of Cloud and Operation Cast Lead, the previous 22-day war, reported that in terms of quality, not duration or quantity of force, but in terms of quality of force, this recent 8-day war was more barbaric and was more ferocious. This is a photograph in Gaza at the funeral parade, although you can't see most of it, but this little girl here is at a funeral parade of Zaki Gadada, who was a friend of mine that was killed, martyred in the recent 8-day war. Now, in the beginning we thought that he was collateral damage, that he was trying to rescue those that were struck in an airstrike, struck in an airstrike on a vehicle, the vehicle in front of him in the road, that he stopped the car to went to help those assumed injured at the site of the first vehicle. But it turns out, because of mistranslation or etc., that my friend Zaki, who was working for the Fatah movement, which, as you know, is the historic and actual rival of Hamas that governs the Gaza Strip, which supposedly Israel was going after, the Fatah movement, he was actually directly targeted, and that Israel locked on to his phone signal, his mobile phone signal, and the airstrike of the drone went directly to his head. And so he, along with other civilians, was decapitated by an Israeli drone strike, leaving behind his dependent family, including young children. So that's just one example of what collateral damage means. Oh, thank you so much. That's one example of what collateral damage means, and I invoke that one purely because it's the one most connected to myself and I'm standing in front of you. Now, there's not enough time, obviously, to go into all of the details of the 8-day war, but as you know, an Egyptian brokered ceasefire supposedly ended the war. I say supposedly because since the truce agreement has come into place, which was meant to grant various marginal improvements to farmers along the border and fishermen at the sea, which has now been redacted, those improvements, there have been over 100 breaches of the ceasefire agreement by Israel. There have been discernibly a few by the Palestinian militant groups, and the generally accepted narrative is that Israel broke the ceasefire first. There has been no evidence provided to suggest that the militant groups launched any rockets or activities first. This is a photograph I took a few days ago when Israel, for the first time since the war, used airstrikes against Gaza. There were no injuries or casualties. They struck military training grounds and military areas of the Al-Qassam Brigade's, Hamas's armed wing in Gaza. It's not here, it's over here. We were forbidden from taking a photograph of the site directly, of course, for security reasons. But the point here was that just a few days ago, on April 2nd, Israel used aerial bombardment on the Gaza Strip, which sets a new precedent. Previously, since the war, they've been willing to use, they've executed 4 people by shooting them in some cases the head. On day 2 post-ceasefire, November 23rd, Anwar Kadei, 23 years old, shot in the mouth, died instantly near the border with Israel in East Khan Yunis in the southern area of the Gaza Strip. That's day 2. So you can see what a ceasefire means to this Israeli entity. November 30th, another 20-year-old shot in the pelvis, died in hospital, again in the southern area near the border. Then this year, January 11th, a 19-year-old shot in the stomach, died on the way to hospital in the northern area of the Gaza Strip. A few days later, a 20-year-old farmer shot in the forehead, died in hospital 1 kilometre away from the border with Israel. Sniper attack, shot in the forehead. So, as you can see, it goes on and it goes on and it goes on. And if we think for a second about what's really changed in Gaza before and after the recent 8-day war, we get to really see an image of what is suffocating life in Palestine. Why did Israel launch this operation? What did it actually gain? Well, not really anything, because the rocket firings continue from Gaza, so obviously it didn't manage to successfully stop the rockets, which was the supposed goal. What it did do was kill 59 Palestinian children and over 100 others. The point here is that if there was no discernible, achievable objective, why was the winter war, the 8-day war, launched? The point really was that it was a bloodletting exercise, and it was predictable on political grounds. What do I mean? What I mean is that Israel's military operations, not just in Gaza but also in the West Bank, have been proven to have a correlation in terms of timing with the Israeli elections, and also, thirdly, correlate with the political situation, of course, in, you guessed it, the United States. So this is why the recent 8-day war was actually predicted by many analysts. What's changed? A few dead Israelis and almost 200 dead Palestinians. Why launch such an operation? This is the West Bank, which I visited a few years ago now, which I haven't touched on, but to very quickly give it some time. The situation in the West Bank is obviously different because there's a full-time on-the-ground military ground occupation, complete with night raids, arbitrary detention, torture, including of children, and etc., as well as killing. And in recent weeks, more killing than in Gaza as a result of that in-your-face military occupation. As you probably well know, restrictions on freedom of movement as a result of arbitrary soldiers' actions, but also a system, a matrix of control of checkpoints and permits and access permissions and etc. Now, coming to a close, you'll be happy to hear, this is a photograph I took from the north area of the Gaza Strip, looking north towards Israel. And for me this really resonates because it sends home this image of the reality that 20 minutes up the road from where I live in Gaza live the young men who press the red plastic trigger switches on the PlayStation joysticks that drop the bombs from the unmanned aerial vehicles on people in Gaza. The point here is that it's a totally unsustainable, insane reality that exists in Palestine and Israel. And it needs our attention to bring it to a close. Because unfortunately, as I said before, there's only so much Palestinians can do imprisoned in Gaza, and it requires international auxiliary pressure and to an increased quantity and quality in the coming months, and hopefully, I won't say years, because hopefully it'll be the conflict, or the situation that is, will be resolved within months, not years. But we need to really pull weight and try and do something to help. Just before I give way, I'd just like to read something that a friend of mine wrote during the recent 8-day war on day 5. It's a poem, Yesterday Night in Gaza, and it's written by Hadil Abououn. Yesterday night I closed my eyes to catch some sleep after a bloody, miserable day. I barely slept. The sound of explosions began approaching. It was everywhere. I was telling myself, it's okay, it's just one, don't worry, it's almost over. Another explosion. I said, that is the last one, then everything will be over. Boom, another one, 2, and 3. It was too much, so I got up from the bed. With every sound of shaking bombs, I was fleeing to my parents' room. Daddy took me in his arms. He tried hard to stop my rainy eyes. Laying between my dad's arms, covering my head under the blanket, closing my eyes to this dark world, having nightmares even while I'm not asleep, that was how I spent this night. Daddy was watching the window and warning me with every rocket that was propelled. He whispered, "Light," a kind of brace, 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 as a sign to hold my breath and get ready for the next explosion. Daddy thought that I was crying because I was afraid of death. Not really. It was a crying with a different flavour. I was crying because it was the first time to feel that I'm going to lose someone of my family. Despite everything that was going on, I was not afraid of death. It doesn't scare me anymore. Even if I knew I would be underground within seconds, what was scaring me was the thought of losing someone I love in these events. I may lose the life of my father, mother, brother, or a friend. I'll be lucky if it is just about losing my own life. With every explosion, I could see death becoming closer to one of them. Many thoughts were spoiling in my head. I was extremely weak. It was the first time to feel that weakness. I was someone I'd never met before. Fire, bombs, explosions, blood and death. It was too much for a girl of my age to endure. To breathe the atmosphere of blood is something terrible, as if you're experiencing death more than once while you are still alive. Then for a moment I closed my eyes. There was an instant of extreme cold and total darkness. Suddenly I was in deep, dreamless sleep. I opened my eyes upon my mother. She was raising her hands to the sky and praying to God to keep us safe. This increased my faith. I said to myself, they can never defeat us. I decided to curse my weakness and shackle it with chains. I decided to be stronger, yes, stronger. That's from Hadil, a teenage friend of mine. So if that's what a teenager of 16 years old can write in a foreign language, you can hopefully get an insight into the general situation. In recent days, the Israeli military prosecutor of operational affairs, that's what they call it, has decided that they're not going to pursue the investigation, the internal investigation, as to why there was the Al-Dalou family massacre, which saw the wiping off the face of the map of 11 members, 9 people of the Al-Dalou family and 2 others from a different family in the Al-Dalou family home during the war. They're not going to investigate it. The same with other notable massacres. I think I will leave it there. I will just say one thing, which is that what Israel got away with in the recent 8-day war was different to the 22-day war. There was no ground invasion. And we must hold on to what is hopeful and be inspired by the kind of resilience of spirit that we hear from, for example, my friend Hadil. There was no ground invasion. The operation lasted just 8 days, not 22 days. And although Israel got away with less in comparison to the comparatively, to speak crudely, more bloody operation Cast-led, the amount of international outrage and even media scrutiny, when there was any, was increased than before. And so there are 2 trajectories. One is that the outrage is steadily increasing, as is the size of the international solidarity, support and sympathy movement for Palestinians' plight. And the second is that Israel is getting away with less over time, because it can't do anything at once. And so that kind of, seeing it like that with those 2 trajectories, I think is a hopeful analysis which we should hold on to. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Harry. That was a fantastic insight into what's happening at present. If I can ask our next speaker, George Galloway MP, give him a round of applause.
distinguished elders, brothers and sisters, comrades and friends, Assalamu alaikum. For a man called Fear, what didn't come across in the talk or the pictures, because he is an almost pristine example of the noble self-effacement historically of the English people. Harry Fear is a very, very brave man. And the way he talked about reporting throughout the 8-day war, you would have thought that he meant he was in the BBC studio at White City or Millbank. But in fact he was right in the front line of a war launched by an utterly ruthless fighting organization, the fifth most powerful military in the world, with absolutely no compunction about killing Englishmen like him any more than they have killing the Palestinians in larger numbers. Harry Fear could have ended up like Tom Herndel, the young Englishman who perished, who was crushed to death as an act of deliberate, premeditated murder because she was standing in front of a Palestinian house that Israel intended to destroy. He could have ended up like the many journalists, mainly Arab and Palestinian journalists, but not by any means all, who have been killed for telling the truth in this conflict. But it didn't stop him broadcasting round the clock in some of the best reportage that we are likely to see from this field of conflict. So it's an honor to share this platform with him this evening and to do so again tomorrow evening in Nottingham at a fundraising dinner where we are both speaking tomorrow evening, I think at 6:30, for any who have friends there that they'd like to tweet or message to ask them to come along. There are still some tickets available, I understand. Harry did a very good job in his words and in his wonderful photographs of, I hope you'll forgive me, a snapshot of a small part of a big picture. Gaza is not Palestine. The occupied territories are not Palestine. And the wars of 2008-9, nor the recent 8-day war, are not the whole picture about Palestine. In fact, Harry twice used the phrase, it goes on, and it goes on. And that was, whether he knew it or not, actually the perfect description of the Palestinian tragedy, which I should like now to place into more context and to at least point the way for the Q&A session that follows me of what needs to be done if this on and on and on disaster is ever to be resolved. I just, in parenthesis, make the point to Harry, who said, well, he hopes not years, he hopes only months, that when I met Ron Mackay at the back of the room here this evening in a Palestinian refugee camp in 1977, I said something very similar to that. And 35 years, 36 years later, we have to listen to Harry show what's still going on and on. So though Israel cannot, he's right, get away with absolutely anything, up till now, it's gotten away with a very great deal. Now this is a matter of great moment to all kinds of people. For religious people, Palestine is holy. It is the land where Jesus walked. It is the land where the Prophet Muhammad ascended to the heavens from the roof of the Al-Aqsa in occupied Jerusalem. For people who care about human rights, who care about liberty, the fact that an entire people has been dispersed to the four corners of the world, that a country has been wiped off the map, that all kinds of massacres and attendant disasters have regularly happened to them, is of great moment. But for those cold-blooded people who are neither religious nor care about human rights or liberty, this is a matter of great moment, because it is the epicenter of a great conflict between the Muslim world and the non-Muslim world. If there is no peace in Palestine, there can be no peace in the Middle East. If there is no peace in the Middle East, there can be no peace in the world. So it is a matter of geostrategic importance, even to the cold-blooded calculator of world events. And of course, there can be no peace in Palestine if there is no justice in Palestine. And justice is not yet on the horizon. And I will, when I come to the end of what I have to say, describe what I think justice would look like. But it's a matter of great moment to British people per se, because it was our country which created this disaster. And in the Houses of Parliament, where I have sat for the last 25 years, this entire tragedy was authored, was written by the British Foreign Secretary, Mr. Balfour, who almost 100 years ago, on behalf of one people, us, promised a second people, the Zionist Jews, who were at that time a tiny percentage of international Jewish opinion. He promised the second people the land which belonged to a third people, the people we've just been watching, almost 100 years later on the screen this evening. As I've said before, even by imperial standards, this was a truly extraordinary act, because Britain did not even possess Palestine as an imperial possession at the time that it gave it away to someone else. And the someone else were a group, and I make this point not pejoratively, there may well be atheists in the room, I don't mean this pejoratively, but to a group of atheistic Jews called the Zionists. Why do I make the point that they were atheistic? Because it was a very long time later that Zionism discovered a biblical justification for their expropriation of the land of Palestine and their extinguishing of its name from the map. There was nothing biblical at all about the Zionist project. It was absolutely, simply and purely a colonial exercise. So much so that these same Zionists to whom Mr. Balfour promised the land of Palestine had previously been petitioning the British and other empires for other territories very far away from the Holy Land of Palestine, on which they could establish their state of Israel. They asked for territory in Uganda, territory in the Seychelles, territory in what is now Argentina. They were merely looking for an imperial patron to give them a territory on which they could establish a European colony, just like the other European colonies which we know only too well in South Africa, in what is now Zimbabwe, and so on. It's ironic to think that if they had been given Uganda, the Seychelles or Patagonia, We might still have a conflict today, but Palestine would be free, and who knows what would be different. But Mr. Balfour's promise, unfortunately, was redeemed. And the caveat that he entered to that promise, that nothing shall be done in the establishment of the Jewish state which would prejudice the rights of the existing Arab population, was of course laughable, because it was a zero-sum game, as the Americans say. If you make Palestine the Jewish state, then by definition it is no longer the territory that it was before. It is subject to massive immigration brought about by many different means, and the character of the territory changes, if necessary, by force. And by force, of course, it was. It is ironic that the State of Israel, which was brought into existence in 1948 by a decision of the United Nations, has such unalloyed contempt for the United Nations today, to the extent that Israel has broken more United Nations resolutions than all the other members of the UN put together. But even more surprising is the absolute cowardice with which the United Nations has viewed these crimes committed by a state brought about by its own resolution. I think you heard Harry say, when he showed you a picture of his friend's house, that there was a United Nations school opposite the dwelling, which was bombed. And of course, it wasn't the only one. Virtually every United Nations building in occupied Palestine, and indeed in the south of Lebanon, has regularly been attacked, and UN personnel regularly murdered, and UN supplies paid for by international taxpayers through the United Nations regularly set on fire and destroyed by Israel. Yet Israel continues to enjoy not just membership, but a special kind of membership of the United Nations. It is never sanctioned. It is never threatened with sanction. No one would dream, for example, of insisting upon inspecting Israel's nuclear facilities, something which Iran is at the moment under threat of invasion and destruction, even though it is permitting regular inspections by the United Nations agency responsible for nuclear matters. No one would even dream of asking Israel if it could inspect its nuclear facilities, because they know that Israel's answer would not only be negative, but would be extremely rude, as is their wont. And they don't want to show themselves up still further as being utterly unable to do anything about Israel's international law-breaking. I was myself a regular visitor to the Jenin refugee camp on the West Bank, which in 2001, I think, was subject to a massacre. Same time as there was a wholesale attack on the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, and priests were killed and lying unburied in the nave. And I waited until it was possible to do so, to enter the Jenin camp with Yvonne Ridley, whom many of you know, and Ron. I think Ron was also there, yes. And when we entered, the camp was still smoking, still on fire, the smell of the dead unburied underneath the masonry was overwhelming. The fighters defending the camp had fought literally until their last bullet and had to stop fighting only because they had no more bullets to fire. A huge number, a contested number, but a very large number of Palestinians were massacred in that camp. Unusually, the United Nations Security Council was summoned on a Saturday evening during that massacre and held an emergency meeting. It unanimously, again unusually, the United States did not veto this particular resolution, though it has vetoed scores of others. And so a resolution passed the Security Council appointing an investigating commission led by, I think, Archbishop Tutu of South Africa to go immediately to Jenin and check the reports of massacre in the camp. That was on Saturday night. On Sunday, the commission members were packing their suitcases to go and carry out the United Nations mandate. But on Sunday evening, the government of Israel told the United Nations to get stuffed, that no United Nations investigating commission would be permitted to enter the camp at Jenin, and so they might as well all go home. What was the United Nations response to this? They went home. They unpacked their suitcases. They went home, and not another word was said. I labor that point because it is a perfect example of how there is one law for Israel and a different law for everyone else. As I said, Iran can be threatened with war and can be subject to a whole raft of sanctions even though it has no nuclear weapons, while Israel has no sanction of any kind upon it, whilst it has hundreds of nuclear weapons, illegally held, undeclared, subject to no international agreement or treaty or regime of inspection. How Iraq was broken on the wheel of sanctions and then invaded and destroyed with 1 million people killed, all in the name of United Nations resolutions, in case you have forgotten. Iraq was invaded because it was said that it was in breach of United Nations resolutions, and 1 million people were killed. And of course, as it turns out, Iraq wasn't even in breach of United Nations resolutions at all. But Israel is in breach of scores of United Nations resolutions, and no one punishes them at all. Unless you count being forced to participate in the Eurovision Song Contest when you're not even in Europe. It's cruel punishment, I know, but it hardly fits the crime. Israel, far from being sanctioned, is endlessly rewarded for the crimes that it is committing and has committed against the Palestinian people. It's treated as a red carpet regime. It's greeted as a normal state. Its leaders, however much blood is on their hands. We've had 2 Israeli prime ministers who were treated as Paka statesmen who had British blood on their hands. Menachem Begin and Yitzhak Shamir, leaders respectively of the Stern Gang and the other one whose name has just slipped my mind, the Stern Gang, the Irgun. These people killed British soldiers, killed British civil servants, hanged British sergeants in the orange groves near Jaffa, blew up the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, killing almost 100 British civil servants. Shamir personally, with his own hand, shot in the face and killed the United Nations envoy Count Bernadotte of Sweden, and he became Prime Minister of Israel and was treated as being an ordinary, respectable world leader. And of course, after them, it got worse. Sharon, still in a coma, is responsible for the deaths of thousands of Palestinians. The butcher of Beirut, who stood on the roof of the Kuwaiti embassy on the outskirts of the refugee camps of Sabra and Shatila, which I know well, and bathed the camps in light so that the fascist militia of the Lebanese Phalange, who were his allies in the invasion of Lebanon in 1982, could go from house to house, bayoneting and murdering literally thousands of Palestinian women and children, their men having departed under international agreement with a promise in writing signed by the US plenipotentiary Philip Habib that the women and children left behind in the camps would not be harmed, upon which promise the PLO's fighters sailed out of the harbour in Beirut to far off Tunisia, leaving their families behind, they thought, in the safe hands of the international community. And no sooner had the ships sailed out of the bay than thousands of their wives and children and elderly parents were murdered in cold blood. Sharon was forced to resign. Such was the international outrage over this massacre. But he came back, not as defense minister, but as prime minister. And as Harry said, ever since then, every time there is an election coming up in Israel, a new war is launched, because nothing gets votes better in Israel than killing Palestinians and further destroying what is left of their society. Although sometimes it doesn't work. Olmert was the criminal responsible for the massacres in the 22-day war in 2008-9, and no sooner had he finished the massacres than the Israeli public threw him out and elected somebody even worse in the form of Netanyahu. I make that point because there is a tendency amongst liberals and progressives to imagine that the peace camp in Israel, the people who oppose all of this in Israel, are somehow capable themselves of changing this situation. This is not true. Some of the people who support the Palestinians inside Israel are the bravest of people and absolutely indefatigable in their work, but they are a tiny number and utterly unrepresentative of the Israeli electorate, which generally speaking will vote for the man who, or woman who promises to be most brutal and ruthless towards the Palestinians and the Palestine question. Therefore, if the Palestinian people cannot themselves prevail, and it is clear after all this struggle that they cannot defeat the fifth most powerful military in the world, and if the Israeli public will not change in a positive direction, and that too is clear, they will not, then something else will have to happen if this is ever to be solved. And that something else involves and includes you, and involves all of us in all the countries around the world who have an interest for one of the three reasons I adumbrated at the beginning, either because of religious feeling, or because of human rights and a love of liberty, or because of cold calculus, or any two from the three, or even all three. Everyone has a vital need to get involved in trying to shift the balance of power, which currently lies overwhelmingly against the Palestinian people and with Israel. When I started out in this struggle in 1975, Israel was much loved in the world. It had, if you look at it as a bank account, a huge amount of capital. To declare in 1975 that you supported the Palestinians was rather like declaring now that you were a supporter of Al-Qaeda or Bin Laden. It was effectively a criminal offense, and certainly guaranteed torrential abuse and hatred and sabotage of all kinds. That has now completely changed in the world. Israel has virtually nothing left in the bank in the world. Its capital in the world is so low that in Cannes a couple of years ago, when the microphones mistakenly overheard the conversation between President Obama and then President Sarkozy, the conversation went exactly, not something, but exactly like this. President Sarkozy said of Mr. Netanyahu on the other side of the room, "I can't stand that man. I can't bear to look at his face. He's a liar." And President Obama replies, and these are direct quotes, President Obama replies, "You can't stand him. I have to take calls from him every other day of the week. I have to deal with him all the time. You can't stand to look at his face. I can't stand to be anywhere near him." That's what the other world leaders think of Netanyahu. Of course, it doesn't stop them giving him guns and money. It doesn't stop them giving them political and diplomatic and mass media support, but at least we know they hate him. And that is a very, very significant change that has occurred in these last near 40 years. The fact that they had to stop the war after 8 days was for two reasons. First, because they dare not move their armed forces into Gaza, because the casualties they would have themselves sustained would have been very considerable. Don't forget that since Hezbollah defeated Israel in 2006 and gave them a bloody good hiding, the Israeli armed forces are not that much up for a fight which doesn't involve just pressing a joystick on a computer which launches a missile with no danger of any of them themselves being hurt. But to invade Gaza and fight street by street, house by house, or hovel by hovel is a very different matter. But the second reason they had to end the war after 8 days was, as Harry said, because of the sense of international outrage which immediately sprang into life, and the political pressure that that put on governments in Western countries and other countries around the world. And we have to keep that pressure up so that that balance finally shifts in our favor. Now, what would justice look like? I'll close with this. And on this there is no consensus, and Harry certainly isn't responsible for what I'm going to say now. and not everybody supports it. But I believe that the only solution to this question is for one democratic state between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea to come into existence, in which Jews and Muslims and Christians live as equal citizens under the law. One man, one woman, one vote. Some say, well, we need a two-state solution. I say to that, well, where is it? President Arafat signed for it 20 years ago in the Oslo agreements, and it is not 1 centimeter closer in view than it was 20 years ago, and will not be 20 years from now, not least because the territory on which these two states were to coexist has so dramatically changed, with settlement, with ethnic cleansing of Palestinians from Arab areas, with the apartheid wall, with the absolute separation between Gaza and the West Bank, and so on. So first of all, of the two-state solution, I say, where is it? And secondly, I tell you, it is no solution at all. Because the vast majority of Palestinians don't live in either the West Bank or Gaza. And the vast majority of Palestinians have never lived in either the West Bank or Gaza. And the millions of refugees have a legal and moral right to return not to another part of Palestine, but to their house and their land, which has been taken from them. The people living in the camp in Jenin, to which I previously referred, they don't want to go and live in Gaza, they want to go and live in Haifa, because they actually have to look at people living in their houses in Haifa who came from London or Paris or New York, mainly from New York, who are living literally in their house. It is no solution to tell them that you've got a mini Bantustan state in Gaza, you can go and live there. So it will not resolve anything having two Bantustans, Gaza and the West Bank, not connected, and with security roads and settlements and walls and all the rest, making it a jigsaw puzzle. And in any case, what's wrong with a democratic state where Jews and Muslims and Christians live as equal citizens under the law, one man, one woman, one vote? Isn't that what we ask for ourselves? When the Boers were finally defeated in South Africa and accepted that apartheid must come to an end, they asked President Mandela, can we have just a tiny piece of the country as a white state? They asked for what's known as the Orange-Free State. They wanted it to themselves so that they could have a white republic. And Mandela answered, we don't believe in white states or black states. We just believe in democratic states. And if it was good enough for post-apartheid South Africa, surely it's good enough for post-apartheid Israel-Palestine. So one state is the thing that I fight for. You could call it Israel-Palestine, you can call it Palestine-Israel, as you please. But it's the only solution that actually is a solution. And though its prospects look dim, they are no dimmer than the two-state solution, but have the benefit of being moral and of being fair and just. So, that's some background. Harry gave you the foreground, and now I think, Elias, it's over to you for Q&A. Wassalamu alaikum. Thank you very much.
Questions? Any questions? Gentleman in the green.
Mr. Galloway, comrade. I'm proud to call myself a friend of Palestine. I'm a member of the Leeds University Palestine Solidarity Group. Last night I was very happy to go to an event in aid of Palestine, where we were kind of raising money for a band called Native Son who were performing to raise money for Palestine. But I do feel, sir, with your kind of words, with your manipulation, with your kind of misrepresentation of a historical record, you actually undermine the you undermine the Palestinian cause. By talking about the Jews as like a European empire, you forget that Jews, genetically, socially, culturally, are a Middle Eastern people, like Arabs and Assyrians and all the other groups who inhabit the Middle East today. And with your talk about the early Jewish Zionist settlers as atheists, yes, Theodor Herzl and many of the other early leaders were atheists, or secular Jews at least. But there are many, many early Zionists who are also very religious, very devout, as you are, I presume. And that should also be acknowledged. And I'd also like to say, with your description of Hezbollah as a resistance organisation, kind of praising how they fought Israel, you ignore the fact that Hezbollah is a subject of Iranian imperialism, and its actions in Syria are absolutely disgraceful, and I can't understand how you take this kind of stance with regard to Syria with regards to the Bashar al-Assad tyranny that's going on in the Middle East today. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. You're a strange kind of member of Leeds University Palestine Solidarity Campaign. I must say, you must be some kind of interloper.
I am quite unique.
Yes, quite unique is one way of putting it. First of all, I described the Zionist leadership as atheists because they were atheists. And I presaged that point by saying that I meant nothing pejorative, though I do think it's very foolish to be an atheist. I did not mean that. I said I did not mean it pejoratively. I meant because now all of Israel's claim to Palestine is predicated on the Bible. That God is an estate agent who promised them the land, and they must have it. And those who were living on it and who did own it must clear off, because the Bible tells us so. And it is an utterly legitimate dichotomy to point out that when they begged the British for Patagonia or Uganda or the Seychelles, they never mentioned the Bible, because these promises were never made to anybody in the Bible.
Can I make a point?
No, you can listen to me, because you might learn something.
Go ahead.
Secondly, the notion that the Jews are a Semitic Middle Eastern people is just bunkum.
It's genetically
It is just bunkum. I refer you to incontestable scholarship. Incontestable scholarship.
Well, can I contest it?
The myth of the Jewish people, which proves beyond all reasonable doubt that the vast majority of Jews in the world in fact are Central and Eastern Europeans who were converted to Judaism in the 8th century. That does not mean...
I refuse to debate with an anti-Semite.
It was all a plan then. It was all a plan. Well, whether he's walked out or not,
Nobody you will.
Whether he's walked out or not, I'm going to finish this answer because...
I was just going to ask him, you listened to his question, you don't have the courtesy to listen to your answer.
It's a provocation. Won't be the last that we'll have to face. My point is this. I don't believe that the vast majority of Jews in the world have anything to do with the Middle East. I don't believe that. But I don't care about that, because I don't draw my conclusions from ancient history. If a Jew is currently living in Palestine, then by definition, my one-state solution allows him to remain there. If he was born there, he must remain there. He's entitled to live there. Whether his people 1200 years ago converted to Judaism in Eastern Europe, or whether their blood showed that they came from the Middle East 2000 or 3000 years ago or not. In the here and now, Jews have a right to live in Palestine if they were born there, but they don't have the right to live in somebody else's house. They don't have the right to live on someone else's land. Not unless they buy it from them. Business. You can buy it, but you can't take it and kick the person out and expect them never to come back, because that certainly isn't going to happen. Well, I'm sorry about that interruption.
Anybody else have any questions? Gentleman at the back.
I'm just wondering, this is the George, you think Morsi's appointment in Egypt has changed anything with Palestine?
Well, that's a difficult question to answer for Harry, who has to pass through Egypt on the way back to Gaza. And it's slightly difficult for me too. It has made a difference. I think that Morsi played a positive role in bringing about the end to the 8-day war that Harry's pictures and talk was concentrated on. I think that the Egyptian people had the right to elect a Muslim Brotherhood government, and they did. And the world has to recognize that and stop trying to subvert it and bring it down. But I don't think that the current leadership of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt is going to challenge Israel in a meaningful way anytime soon. But I do believe that the Egyptian masses in the end will tell. Their feelings for Palestine are overwhelming, and in the end they will force, if not this president, then the next, to begin to act differently in relationship to Palestine and Israel. One thing we can say, Mubarak, the agent, the tyrant, was Israel's close ally. No other Egyptian president ever will be Israel's close ally. They may not move to scrap Camp David, they may not break diplomatic relations, but they will never again be Israel's ally, acting openly in Israel's interest. That's my view on Morsi.
Gentleman in the blue shirt.
Can I come back to the one-state solution, George? Because, I mean, I'm really a one-stater, but I have to say that amongst the Palestinians I know, many of them are not. And I think, in a sense, my belief in the one state as being a good solution is less important to me than my belief in that it must be a Palestinianly determined solution. So that's one point I'd like to make. Second point you've touched on, the question was to be who would be, as it were, a national of this one state. You said all Jews who were born in Israel would be entitled to be there. Of course, many Jews were not born in Israel, and from the Israeli side, which I'm by no means an advocate of, the notion of some sort of right of Jews to come there is extremely important, as indeed, of course, it is for the Palestinians, because Palestinians regard it as extremely important that Palestinians, even if they were not born in Palestine, should have the right to come. So there is that very important question of who should be the national, because if you're talking about democracy, this is the group who will be, as it were, the demos. So I'd like your views on that. But also, more importantly, even if that is sort of agreed and supported by the Palestinians, that that is the aim, how do we get from here to there? And Harry's only given us a few months.
Yes. Well, first of all, I absolutely reject the idea that anyone who is a Jew has the right to, quote-unquote, return to Palestine. If you think about it, it's absurd. I could become a Jew. How could that give me the right to return to Palestine and live there in somebody else's house? I mean, it's an absurd idea. A Chinaman can become a Jew. There are Ethiopian Jews. There are Jews all over the world who have, under Israel's constitution, the right to return to a Palestine that they have never seen, never been in, have no provable connection to at all. And indeed, recent scholarship, as I have indicated, shows, I think incontestably, that they have never been in Palestine. But a Palestinian has the right to return to Palestine because he is a Palestinian, because his father and mother and their father and mother and their father and mother are provably from Palestine, and indeed still hold a key for a house in which someone else is living. So these two rights are not comparable in any way. The question of Palestinian support for a one-state solution or a two-state solution depends on which Palestinians you are asking. I can assure you, if you came to Lebanon with me and went to the camps in Lebanon where hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees live, you won't find anybody who does not support a one-state solution, because that's the only solution that sees them leaving the camp and going back to their country, indeed going back to their own land and their own house. So it depends who you ask. As to how we get there, it'll have to be by a combination of the hammer of Palestinian resistance and the anvil of international solidarity. That's how apartheid in South Africa was broken, and that's how the Zionist state will be broken. I told you it's a dim and distant prospect, but it's no dimmer at all than the two-state solution, which isn't a solution. That's why I prefer the campaign that I'm fighting.
Just before we come to you, I have a question for Harry. Those that are here today, what can we do to make a difference?
I think there are 4 to 6 things we can do. The last 2 are peripheral. The first thing we can do is continue to raise awareness about what's going on, so that the number of people who know they need to do something can increase, and that those that do know they need to do something are able to articulate the arguments for that fight. The second is to maintain position in mainstream politics by supporting those MPs and candidates that take a meaningful position. So not to forget that there has to be a mainstream political role. The third is to heed the call to visit the occupied territories as they're known, Palestine, what's left of it, and to become witnesses and delegates for the truth, because that means an awful lot of difference in many ways, but not least to Palestinians that are stuck there. And also number 4, to boycott the corporations that are criminally responsible for propping up Israel's illegal dominance over the Palestinians in the occupied territories. The 5th thing is to give what charity we can to those that need it. My God, in Gaza are there hundreds of thousands of people that need it. And 6th is to pray that the situation gets better in hours or weeks, not months or years.
Gentleman at the back.
For Mr. Galloway. George, I just wondered if you could give us any insights in how the Palestinian situation's currently viewed in British politics, kind of behind the scenes. I mean, well, we've got Cameron and Miliband making public statements, so I just wondered if there's any changes gone on in the last few years, especially with what's gone on in Gaza.
Well, as I said in a debate in Parliament recently that I won the right to hold by ballot on Britain's relations with the Arab world, I made the point that in order to be the British Foreign Office Minister for the Middle East, it is compulsory to have been a member of the Friends of Israel. This is an empirical fact. If you are not a member of the Friends of Israel, you will never be the Foreign Office Minister for the Middle East. So that tells you something about the relative strengths of the Palestine lobby in Parliament and the Israeli lobby in Parliament. You can number in hundreds of parliamentarians those who declare their support for Israel, and a fraction of that who actively support the Palestinian cause. And that's gotten no better in the current Parliament. In fact, it's gotten worse. In fact, one of the things about New Labour is that since Mr. Blair took over the Labour Party in 1994, it has become basically a prerequisite to getting on in the New Labour Party to be an avowed supporter of Israel. And we had the grotesque spectacle just a few weeks ago on the front page of the Jewish Chronicle, Ed Miliband declaring, "I am a Zionist." Now, for those who know Mr. Miliband's antecedents, his father, late father, Ralph Miliband, and his mother, who still lives, are both Jews who fled the Holocaust in Europe and sought sanctuary here in Britain. And from their first day and until now declared their absolute opposition to Zionism. But Ed Miliband, the son of these parents, who fled the Holocaust but have resolutely opposed Zionism, Ed Miliband has now declared, "I am a Zionist." You can consult the front page of the Jewish Chronicle for the relevant report. I made the point to Mr. Miliband that this probably cost him 1 or 2 votes. Certainly in Bradford, I hope. But the calculation that he has made is that he cannot win the election if the supporters of Israel are against him. He may be right, he may be wrong, but the fact that that calculation even has to be made is a measure of the problem. There are some bright spots. After the 22-day war, 2008-9 in Gaza, David Cameron described the situation of the people in Gaza as being a prison camp, the largest prison camp in the world. Israel went bananas about it, demanded that he apologize and withdraw, but he didn't. And therefore that is a prime ministerial statement, that Gaza is the largest prison camp in the world and that something must be done about it, said Mr. Cameron. Of course he didn't actually then do anything about it, but at least he said it. I don't know, Harry, if you've got a view of internal British politics, but welcome if you do.
I think that the trend is towards I mean this in a very abstract and not scientific manner, that the trend towards sympathy for the Palestinians at the expense of support for Israel is something which is not only affecting the general population, but therefore also automatically the parliamentarians. And although empirically the number of supporters of Palestinians may not be increasing, clearly in Parliament, I think that there are certainly marginal improvements in the general abstract of what this country is doing.
Any more questions? Lady at the front.
Question for Harry. You've spent a lot of time in Palestine and spoken to and befriended a lot of Palestinian people. Would you say that there's more hope now amongst them, now that there is more international sympathy for their plight?
There are 2 camps in one sense in the occupied territories. The first is those particularly youth Palestinians who have internet connections and the time and luxury to be connected with the international solidarity movement. And there are of course a fraction, they're in the absolute minority. And then there's the rest of the Palestinians who to a large extent don't even know about the international solidarity. and it's certainly not part of Palestinian news cycles regularly. Many people don't even know who Rachel Corrie was. They don't know who Tom Herndl was. So that's a problem. I'm thinking particularly of Gaza. The situation is less extreme like that in the West Bank. I think that answers your question.
Take one last question.
Amongst the things that you suggested we might do, you said bear witness to truth by visiting Palestine.
Yeah.
As far as the West Bank is concerned, that's relatively easy. If you're lucky on a good day, you can get through Tel Aviv airport. On the other hand, as far as visiting Gaza is
people of your demographic more easily than people of my demographic.
No, not at all. I was on a route with 30 and everybody got through. 2 people had some difficulty, everybody got through.
I can tell you that if you try to get into Gaza, you will get through 99%. But there are, a friend of mine only a few weeks ago was banned from Israel just because he'd been to Gaza. The point is that going to the West Bank is much harder than going to Gaza, and that speaking now, you can go to Gaza very, very easily. It's basically paperwork. And there's a guide on my website about how to do it, gazareport.com. And in July I'm taking a convoy to Gaza of internationals, particularly media workers and campaigners. So what we're trying to do, and what I try to encourage, is to advocate for people going, because it's a prime time when it's not particularly dangerous and when it is easy to go to Gaza, which compared to the West Bank is starved of international attention and solidarity. So to try and make some balance there.